Hello everyone, Alex here from warnoffkeys.com, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can create a dynamic help command. Now in a previous video we created a very basic help command where we had to actually hard code in all of our commands, and since then we've created a dynamic command handler. So if you've been following the series, you'll be familiar with this file right here. And if you don't have access to this file or this entire project, you can clone this from the GitHub repository found in the video description. Now, one of the advantages to a dynamic command handler, if we open up one of our commands here, I've added a description property, and it simply just says adds two numbers. We can actually use this to create a dynamic help command. So whenever you go to add a new command, it'll automatically be added to your help menu. Here's an example of what we'll be creating today. So here we see all of our commands and a brief description here. Now, of course, you can make this look better through an embed, which I'll leave that for you to do. I have a video on that as well. A link to that will be in the video description, but I'm going to be solely focusing on the functionality to get dynamic help commands working. So with that said, let's get started. Okay, so inside of this project here, if I open up my index, we see that currently throughout the series, we've been importing the commands inside of our main file. We need to move this functionality into its own file. The reason for that is that it's going to make our index file more clean, but more importantly, we'll then be able to fetch all of the commands for the help command, and that way we can loop through all of them. So I'm going to make a new file within our commands folder. This one will be called load-commands.js. I'm going to move this over to the right side of my view, and I'm going to minimize our navigation here. I'm then going to move our path and fs imports into the load commands, and then I'm going to export a function. So module.exports. This is going to take in a client, and then we can simply take all of the code here when it comes to actually calling the read commands function, and we could just paste it right in here. Now our main file here is much cleaner. However, we do have to actually import this. So constant load commands equals require. We're going to go into the commands folder and then import load commands. And then we're going to call this passing in our client. That's working. We can now close our main file. And one thing we want to do here is this client might be optional. So if we're passing in the client like we're doing in our main file, then we're going to actually register the commands. But if it's not there, then we do not want to register the commands, and that means that whatever is calling this method essentially just wants a list of the commands. To fix this, we can simply just say if client, because client will be undefined if it's not passed in, and so therefore it'll be a falsy value, and so this if statement is going to ensure that we only actually call command based, passing in our command options, if the client is actually present. So now, the last thing we need to do in this file is I'm going to create an array. This will be called commands. And then after we load our options, I'm going to push that to our array. So commands.push option. And then at the end here, I'm going to return options. So this file is done. I can go ahead and close this. I'm going to make a new command here. This will be called help.js. I'm going to start off by loading the load commands function that we just created. So load commands equals require load commands. I'm also going to import the prefix we have from our configuration. So require, we're going to go back a directory and gain access to our config.json file. I'm going to export a JSON object here, and this is where we're going to define the actual command. So the first property would be our commands. We can say help or h. Next, we're going to add a description, and this will say describes all of this bot's commands. And then we're going to have our callback, which will be a function with message arguments and text as its arguments here. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to define what we're actually going to say. So we can say let reply, and then here we can say I am the tutorial bot. Here are my supported commands. And then we're going to add two /n characters, which represent new lines. Now we want to actually load the commands and then loop through them, and then concatenate a description for each command onto this reply text. So we can say const commands equals load commands. Note that we're not passing in a client here. So whenever we go to actually call this, the client is undefined, and therefore we're not going to register the command again. This is important to remember. So going back, I can now loop through the commands. So for const command of commands. And one thing I want to do is sometimes we have different permissions here, such as delete channel has the administrator permission. We don't actually want to notify people of commands that they don't have access to run. And so the first thing I want to do is check for permissions. So we're going to gain access to the permissions. So let permissions equals command.permission. Now keep in mind that I'm using an S right here because this is going to be multiple here in a second. However, this is going to be without an S. And so first of all, we want to make sure that we actually specify the permission. So if permissions, then we want to create a variable called has permission, so that equal to true. The reason why we're doing this is that a command might have multiple permissions, and so we have to actually loop through them. However, if you've been following along, you know that some permissions can just be strings, or you can pass them in as arrays with multiple other permissions. And so we have to keep that in mind when implementing this functionality here. So with that said, we essentially want to make sure that if something is a string, that we convert it into an array. So we can say if type of permissions is exactly equal to string, then permissions equals an array with the only element being permissions. And so now if it's a string, it'll then become an array. So we know for sure that we're working with an array now. Now we can loop through that. So const permission of permissions. And we can say if not message.member.has permission, and we'll pass in the permission string. Here we can simply say has permission equals false, and we can break. Now, the reason why we have to use this variable here is because we are trying to loop through all of the permissions, and then we can say if not has permission, then we want to continue. Now, if we just continued inside of here, it would just continue inside of this for loop or this nested for loop. However, we want to continue off of this for loop right here on line 12 because we want to just move to the next command. We don't want to return or break or something like that because we still want to list future commands. We just want to ignore commands that they do not have access to. Now, after that, we are going to format the text. And so I'm going to create a few variables here. We can create the main command, and this is going to equal command.commands index 0. However, this has a similar problem. If we look at invites, we see that this can be a string, and so index 0 is just going to be the character I. However, if we look at tickets, we see we have ticket and support, and so this could be a string or an array. And so we can use a ternary operator here. We can say type of command.commands is exactly equal to string with a question mark. And if this is the case, we just want to use it. So command.commands. This means that we're using an actual string, such as this right here. However, if this isn't the case, that means it's an object, and so it should be an array. And so we can say command.commands index 0. And so now we have access to the main command. After that, I'm going to want to gain access to the arguments. And so I can say const args. And we're going to use another ternary operator here. So we can say command.expectedArgs. And if this is the case, then we're going to use a string. Otherwise, we're going to use a different string. Just to recap, expected arguments is going to be what we're going to send to the user if they enter the incorrect syntax. What I'm wanting to do here is I'm wanting to use a template literal. I'm going to add a space, and then I'm going to insert in command.expectedArgs. We're going to leave these quotes empty. So if there is no expected args, then arguments will be blank. Next, we want to gain access to the description, and this time we can actually just simply destructure this. So constant description equals command. Now we can concatenate this. So reply is plus equal to. We're going to make this bold. We're going to insert our main command. We're going to then immediately insert our arguments. And you see how we're not adding a space here? If I were to add a space here and there were no arguments, there would be an excess space here because we're adding a space afterwards as well. That's why we only want to add a space whenever expected arguments actually exist. So I can remove that, and then I can add in, actually we're going to remove that space and add in two stars again to end the bold, and then we're going to add a space here. And so we can say equals and then description, and then /n to create a new line. Now outside of this for loop, we can simply say message.channel.send reply. And so I can save this. However, I need to go through all of my commands and add in a description. So we see how I add a description here. I need to go through all of my commands and add in a description. So this one can be add two numbers. Invites can have a description that'll say something like displays who has invited the most members. I'm going to go through and actually add these in right now. Okay, so I just got done adding a description to all of the different commands. Now there's one thing we have to do before we can test this. If we look inside of our load commands file, this is inside of the commands directory, and so we're actually going to loop through and try and load this as a command, which is going to cause a problem. So right here on line 16, we're saying else if file is not exactly equal to base file, which is our command base.js, which is what we're actually not wanting to import as well. However, because we're only using this string here once, I'm going to simply just say and file is not exactly equal to load-commands.js or whatever you name this file. Now with that said, we shouldn't actually try and import this specific file and try and use it as a command, because obviously we're not exporting a JSON object with the correct command syntax. So I can save this. I can run my bot with node index.js. Okay, I get an exception because inside of load commands, I'm trying to import this from the commands folder because this was previously one directory back. So I can actually get rid of that and I can just import the local command base file within that directory. If I restart, we also get a similar error here. This directory here has to be itself. And so we can simply just put in a dot or dot forward slash either way, and that'll reference its current directory. And that's because we were reading the commands directory from one directory back. However, now that we're inside of it, we have to reference itself, which we can do with this dot. So now if we restart one more time. Okay, so another error within the load commands. This is supposed to be returning commands, not options. I think I just wrote option, and so that was on my mind right there when I wrote that. So now if we restart one more time, there we go. We've registered all of our commands. Going into Discord, if I run !help, we then see I am the tutorial bot, and here are my supported commands. We see all the commands here. One thing we forgot to add though is the actual prefix. So we actually imported that at the top here, but if we scroll down, we can add that right directly after we added the bold symbols. So we can just put that right there with no space. If we save this and restart our bot, we can then run help again, and we see the actual prefix that we want. And now we see that we have all of the commands with their syntax and a brief description. Again, you can use embeds to make this more visually appealing. And also you can expand on this functionality to allow people to use, for example, help ping, and then you can send a different message depending on that. However, I'm going to leave that for your own implementation, but if you need help, then join the Warnoff-Keys Discord and I'll be sure to help you there. Thanks for watching this Discord.js tutorial. If you want to learn more about Discord.js, consider clicking on the playlist you see on your screen now. If you need help, feel free to leave a comment or ask in the Warnoff-Keys Discord, which can be found in the video description.